Okay, so I'm Mike Zephyr, and I'm an associate professor at in the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne. And this is QMNet, or the Quantitative Methods Network, which is kind of an informal internal thing at the University of Melbourne. And today we've got a talk from Ben Fulcher. And Ben is is a senior lecturer in physics at the University of Sydney. And he likes to think about systems and the signals they produce with a focus on the physical principles underlying the organization of neural systems. And you did a postdoc at Monash. You spent 4 years there doing that. Is that true, Ben?
Correct.
I got a little additional information there during our little chat. Okay, so let me hand it over to you and take it away. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Mike. So the talk I'm going to give today is on the need for interdisciplinary comparison when analyzing time series. I'm not sure what the normal situation is, but I'm happy for people to interrupt as I go. Otherwise, we'll see. There'll hopefully be time at the end for questions. The chat should interrupt me. Otherwise, you can shout at me or something like that. Okay, so what happens when I go to full screen? Michael, can you see?
Definitely.
That works. Yeah, all good?
Yeah, perfect. If I get Zoom bombed or if there are kids or something, I usually turn off my video. So if I disappear, I'm still listening.
Okay, no worries. You don't have to. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining. Hopefully you find some of this interesting. So I'll be giving the talk across 3 different parts, and I'll kind of give a summary of each part as I go. And so this is the first part. And I try to get the message across in this part that time series are measured, simulated, studied, and analyzed across a very wide variety of disciplines, contexts, types of problems. That applies within science, within academia. People study time series in archaeology, across sociology, and also in industry a lot. And so the question is, as the picture at the top there, people tend to have their own types of data and their own models and methods for analyzing that data and different types of questions that they ask of that time series data. But they tend to do that separately in their different subfields. And there aren't a lot of mechanisms to interact and to compare. And so this will be a common theme throughout this talk about how do we get people to compare, what's the value of comparison, and what can go wrong when you don't compare sufficiently broadly. And so in the blue box there, this first part, I'm going to try and show that the structure in the data that we analyze, measure, simulate, study, analyze, etc., is often similar. The types of methods we use are often similar, but we don't talk so much, right? Are each of these different fields and subfields reinventing the wheel with respect to time series methodology? Is there actually a lot to be learned from looking at the way another field deals with time series? Can we incorporate their methods into our way of looking at our time series data, etc.? Okay, so when we first looked at this problem, I guess a bit over 10 years ago, we kind of recognized that no one had really attempted to structure an interdisciplinary literature like this before. Right, it's the situation that I just described where you have lots of different people analyzing time series. Pretty much in every department of a university, people will be analyzing time series, but there's not a lot of comparison of how those approaches are similar or different. And so just like if you want to learn about what types of butterflies there are, how big do their wings get, what types of colors of butterflies, what are the different shapes you find, you need to measure lots of butterflies, right? That's your starting point. And so on the right here, if we want to understand the structure of time series and the methods we use to analyze them, we first need to collect many time series from across different disciplines, collect different analysis methods where people try and quantify the structure in those time series. And then our approach is going to be to use the properties of the data as measured by the methods to organize the data. So we can put similar pieces of data close to each other in some space. And also we were going to use the performance of our methods on the data to organize our methods. So 2 methods that have similar behavior across data, we're going to say they're similar methods. So in this way we can organize both the data and the methods we use to analyze our data. And I'll go a bit into that foundational point here. So this is some examples of an interdisciplinary variety of time series. People are measuring fluctuations of gases in medical contexts. They're measuring heart rates of kids. Some people are studying audio of different sound effects, finance, etc. You can see just visually there's lots of different types of structures in the data that we measure from the world around us. And all of these can be represented, at least in the case that I'll consider in this talk, as an ordered vector of real values shown at the top there, x1, x2 through to xn. So we're only considering data with a uniform sampling rate, such that we can just ignore the time labels, and we're not considering multivariate time series for this purpose. So it's just a single measurement taken repeatedly of a system through time at an equal sampling rate. Okay, so there's many different types of methods also used to analyze time series. And in order to make it easy to compare, we're going to consider methods for time series analysis in the simple form of taking a time series and outputting a single real number. So, like I've written there, how do we reduce a complex time-varying pattern to a single informative summary statistic? And summary statistics can be things like, what's the mean of the data? I've shown some examples of things there. What's the entropy of the data according to some way of defining that? What's the dimension of the attractor in the embedding space? What's its autocorrelation at lag 7, etc. All sorts of things you can do. And you can ask these sorts of questions like, what's the power in low frequencies, right? What's the variance? So scientists have come up with lots of different methods to take a complex time-varying signal and convert it down to a single real number that's meant to concentrate some piece of information about its structure or the patterns that are contained in it. And so this is really the target for what we're trying to compare on the methodological side. And so when I did a survey of all these types of things, we found many different types of concepts that we've organized and implemented here. So this is the first thing that we built, was comparing the different methods. So we have a toolbox that computes 7,000 different statistics from time series that are taken from all these different types of methodological families. I'll talk more about that later. But this is just to say there are many types of time series analysis methods that we surveyed and implemented. And so this is a kind of good summary of what happens when we apply many different time series analysis methods that take a time series and extract this concentrated summary statistic of its dynamics. And we also applied those summary statistics to a really wide variety of time series. So this was the first big figure of this exercise, now 7 years ago. So what we did was we put every row in this matrix to represent a time series. And you can see the wide variety of types of data that we looked at there in figure A. And then we also took all these different statistics that you can take from a time series and arrange them as columns in the matrix, such that every element of the matrix is, I applied algorithm Y to time series X. So applying every algorithm to every time series gives me a full matrix. And when I organize my columns, I'm organizing my scientific methods. And what we've done here is reorder columns to put similar columns together. So time series analysis methods that give similar outputs across data will be organized close to each other. And you can see there's a lot of interesting structure in this matrix. We did the same with the rows. We reorganized time series to put similar time series together. And we can define similarity as having similar outputs across these almost 9,000 different features in this case. So this was the starting point for us starting to find patterns, interesting patterns in interdisciplinary collections of both data and methods for quantifying structure in data. Maybe I skip this bit. So this was the kind of the startings of taking this siloed interdisciplinary field and starting to bring together rather than people fighting and going, oh, my method from physics is way better than your method from medicine, or, you know, this non-stationarity violation means you shouldn't have used that method, you should use my method instead, or all these kind of opinions about what method you should use on what data, starts to become closer to being systematic, because we can compare across methods, we can compare across data in an unbiased way, and start to have a better understanding of how different methods might relate to each other, which methods may be better or worse for a given task, etc. So this was our first step. We've assembled collections, both of data and of methods for quantifying their structure. Oh, I didn't realize that was going to pulse. Okay, part 2, we have interdisciplinary comparison of methods. So I'm going to do methods as part 2, and then I'm going to focus in on data for part 3. And so that's an example up the top there in that figure, where you can now zoom in on a method of your choosing. So in here, I zoomed in on approximate entropy with parameters 2 and 0.2. I'm saying this is the method I use to find out how disordered my heart rate data is. And I can say, what are the most similar methods from across science to my favorite method? And here I've retrieved all the most similar methods. Each method is a node in this network. And you can see that I'm pulling together methods proposed in different disciplinary contexts from different fields, maybe from decades ago, and just they're pulling up as similar to the method that I tend to use, just from how similar its behavior is across real data. And so this process and having access to this library can allow you to do some interesting things. And in the box there, I've written some summaries that often, and this was actually one of the main motivations for us doing this work, is that you'll see a paper saying, look at this awesome new method, look how well it does on my hand-picked data set with no comparison to other methods. And so you can never know from reading that paper whether that new method really is new, or does it reproduce something they did in another field decades ago? Where are its weaknesses? How good are its strengths relative to baseline, etc. And so having this database of methods from across science allows you to make those claims more precisely, because you can compare across all other methods and show where your method does better than others, where it's doing worse than others, it must do worse on others in some data contexts, etc. I'll go into that more later. And then, does your complicated method actually justify that complication? Sometimes there'll be a simpler alternative that can do just as well on the task at hand, but you wouldn't know because you can't compare across thousands of methods manually. But now that we've implemented all these, we can do that in an automated way. And I say at the bottom there, without comparison. So making this comparison, we can distinguish progress. It's not just lots of little hand-picked reports with a lack of comparison, but now we can actually say, yes, this is a new method. Yes, it is better on these types of data. We could only do that when you've been comprehensive and systematic in comparison. Okay, so here's an example of how you can use our library of time series analysis features to do a task, in this case, a time series classification task. So the theme here is that when you compare across a big library of time series features, you can immediately pick those that do well on your problem. So instead of hand-picking a time series analysis method, you can say, well, here's the data, this is what I want to do, which methods do well on this task? And so it can be like a data-driven way of picking the types of methods that are best suited to the task that you're interested in solving. And so an example here is you might have movement data from flies of 2 genotypes, and you want to distinguish those genotypes. You might have physiological measurements from people with schizophrenia or healthy controls. Or you might have speech recordings of people with Parkinson's disease or healthy controls, and you want to distinguish the Parkinson's from those recordings. And so you have this big data set, and then the question becomes, what analysis method should I use to find differences between types A and types B? What statistics should I use to summarize? And typically you might look at the data and go, oh, type A seems to have these bursts. Maybe I construct a statistic about burstiness, or type A seems to vary a bit slower, maybe I should look at the Fourier power spectrum. Or you might kind of have this artistic way of using your expertise to come up with statistics that you think visually correspond to differences that you see in those types of data. But because we have implementations of thousands of methods, you can take a data-driven approach of just comparing the performance of all these features from across science, and maybe it flags something you would never have thought of to look at. Maybe it's some entropy measure that's common in medicine, or maybe it's some burstiness measure from astrophysics comes up and says, this is really good at separating type A from type B. And it gives you a place to start in terms of picking a method, an interpretable method for your problem. And so when you find those methods, you go, actually, look, this entropy measure from medicine is much higher in type A than type B. And then you can start to interpret, okay, that means that maybe type A is a bit less predictable, is a bit less temporally predictable than type B, or things like this. It gives you interpretable insights about your data. I won't talk so much about low dimensional structure. But yeah, this is kind of inverting that artistic process of the first page on every time series analysis textbook will be, look at your data every time first. Don't ignore that step. And we're kind of doing it the opposite way. We apply all the methods, find the best ones, then we try and understand how they work. And I think if you were to start a project where you wanted to do this, it would at least be good to know what types of methods from across science are doing well at the task you're trying to solve. Gives you a starting point to then look in those types of literatures rather than using your intuition, which is intrinsically limited. Okay, so this is implemented in this MATLAB package with documentation. And if you don't want to compute thousands of features, this takes a long time and you need a MATLAB license. We're in the process of making reduced sets that kind of reproduce most of the performance of the full set. So here's one that you can run in R, Julia, Python, whatever you want, because it's coded in C, and it'll run in milliseconds rather than minutes. And it captures most of the performance of the full library. So I just mentioned that for those who recoil at the mention of MATLAB. So that's here at this URL. I'll post these slides afterwards, or it's being recorded anyway. So. Okay, so here's some examples of things we've done with this. I didn't talk so much about the low dimensional structure, but when you're characterizing a time series by over 7,000 different properties, it then gives a very rich characterization of every time series in your data set. You're not just characterizing it with a feature vector of a handful of features. You're using 7,000 features that give a very comprehensive summary of different types of properties in your data. So when you look at low dimensional projections of that high dimensional feature space, you often reproduce interesting structure that matches with the domain knowledge. So in the top right there, there's EEG signals from 5 different groups. The orange is during a seizure, A and B are eyes open, eyes closed, and then C and D are periods, interictal periods of the seizure from different parts of the brain. You can see they're being organized nicely. We've classified different emotions from speech. We can distinguish different Swedish leaf shapes and Parkinson's speech. Okay, many people have used this for different tasks. Whenever you have a time series and you try and distinguish them, people at the top there have used it for like energy built and buildings. Can I determine whether a vacuum cleaner's on or the washing machine's on from looking at the smart meter, or time series? What are those guys at the top? Looking at motor evoked potentials in multiple sclerosis, distinguishing hand gestures, and lots of different neural applications. So people have used this for a very broad variety of tasks, either using the full feature set to classify time series, or zooming in and getting specific features that do best for that task. Okay, so I'm going to give a couple of case studies. Yeah, I'm doing okay for time. I'm going to give a couple of case studies to just hammer home this point about comparison, which is after all the title of the talk. And there's two questions here in the grey text. So without comparison, how do I know whether any paper that has a manually selected analysis method is optimal or close to optimal? And how can I know whether the complexity of a proposed method is required or justified in giving better performance over simpler methods? So an example here in that black box, which is, I didn't realize was, it's also a bit of a black box approach. They took lots of different discrete wavelet transform features. They took a real mishmash of things, discrete wavelet transform features. They got Lyapunov exponent estimates. They put it through a independent components analysis and then did radial basis function kernel SVM. And they go, look, we got 98% accuracy at this task. This is an example of one of these papers that has over 600 citations last I looked. And they make very strong claims about this, right? The methods should be used for intelligent devices, for epilepsy, whatever. And so you see all these papers like this, where they're just using, now it would be a deep neural network if this was a 2020 paper, with another variety of hand-picked processings with no comparison to other features or other types of ways of setting up the problem. So when we tried to reproduce the same task, you can see there in panel C that the standard deviation of the data is getting 100% accuracy. It's completely separating the seizure and no seizure time series. So in this case, you get a highly cited paper saying you should do wavelet transforms, Lyapunov exponents, independent components analysis, radial basis function, kernel SVM. And we're going, you could just put a threshold on the standard deviation and get 100% accuracy. You don't need to do all this and get 98% accuracy. And indeed, the features that were driving their accuracy were ones that were sensitive to the variance in the data. And so it's just an example of how you can really get your intuition out from trying to follow trends and looking fancy by using complex methods. And if you don't compare, you can often miss that much simpler things are going on in your data. And as a reader, I now have very little ability to assess progress when I read a paper, because how can I tell if this really complex method without comparison is actually doing better than what standard or simpler methods could do? And if you were ever editing or peer reviewing a paper, you should be on the lookout for this type of behavior. It's now much easier to at least make basic comparisons of methods. Should I go through this one as well? This one is just to say that when we're trying to distinguish normal sinus rhythm from congestive heart failure, boxes A and B up the top there, these are kind of sequence time series of intervals between RR intervals between successive heartbeats. And so when we pull the best performing features on this task, we found these kind of four main clusters of features. And some of them are sensitive to the location in the data. This was known, that the mean of normal sinus rhythm rates are longer. There's another box of control entropies. PNN was a standard measure for this task. That's another little group of methods, and each of those have been published in separate papers. And that box labeled E there, we had some new methods, but also some well-known methods on fractal scaling, linear models for the data, etc. So when we did this, we were kind of retrieving all the approaches that had been published in the literature, organizing them into groups on how similar they were. Like all the individual reports don't show you how different methods relate to each other. And also we could see that, so the one labeled E there, the variance ratio test from economics, that had never been published in this context. And so you could be cheeky and write a new paper on that, but you can see that it highly correlated to existing methods. And so you'd know that by writing that paper, you wouldn't be contributing progress to the field, because that method with a new name was actually performing the same as methods that already exist. So it's a nice way of just pulling together a diverse literature, structuring it, and seeing how it performs on a given problem. Okay, I won't talk about this or this. I'll come back to that at the end, I think. Yeah, I'll skip this. When we do our low-dimensional projections of our high-dimensional feature space, we've done some tests with simulated data to show that we're reproducing the underlying parametric variation in the data set. This is just kind of the power of leveraging thousands of features at once. We can do some cool things in inferring the underlying properties of the system that is being measured. Can come back to this at the end if necessary, but I thought I'd get on to what was meant to be the focus of the talk, which is on the interdisciplinary comparison of time series data. And so this is the paper that was sent around. It's come out recently. And this is that final piece in the puzzle I've been building through this talk, that we can compare in the same way our pieces of data. As I've just shown, we can compare our pieces of time series analysis methods. So just like before, where methods have similar properties across different disciplines, we also see that data from different systems often have similar properties. Data simulated from generative models often matches that of real data. This is the dream of our time series modeling in general, that we want our simulations to match as much as possible the structure of our data, so we can infer what generative mechanisms might be underlying an empirical data stream. And also it gives us a context with which to understand the strengths and weaknesses of a time series analysis method. What types of data do they do well on? When do they do badly? Etc. You can only ask that if you have a very diverse and comprehensive set of data to test on. So an example up the top here is when we took every time series, computed our over 7,000 numbers. So every time series is a point in this 7,000 dimensional feature space. We then did dimensionality reduction with one of Mike's least favorite dimensionality reduction methods, TSNE. And so we have two different dimensions here, and we can see that different types of systems are occupying different parts of the space, right? And when we zoom in on specific parts of the space, we can see similarities in the types of dynamics represented. So you can see that on the edges. So say in the top right is A. So that's this little section labeled A in the main plot. And you can see there's share prices, a damp-driven pendulum simulation, another stochastic differential equation simulation. They've all got this type of very autocorrelated drift-like dynamics. When we zoom in on that bit labeled B, we see there's this kind of very bursty audio characteristics, and that's reproduced by this driven damped flow in orange. And then C, we have what looks like a weird set of time series. They're all labeled from different systems, but we see that they all have this characteristic sort of noisy periodic characteristics, whether it's gait from someone with Parkinson's disease to measurements in the ionosphere over Bermuda, etc. So it's just a way to kind of put all our data in one space and compare it, because we're assessing two time series as being similar if they have similar properties as measured by these 7,000 different measures. So if two time series have similar autocorrelation, they have similar entropy, they have similar stationarity, they have similar periodic properties. If all these things are similar, they'll sit close together in this space. So we're using a really diverse definition of time series similarity to organize a very diverse library of time series data. And so this is what we've built, is a way for people to actually contribute to this, to growing this library. So it's a database of time series data that started with what I collected through my PhD and has been growing since. And now you can upload your own data and it will be part of this database. And once the data is on there, you can download everything. You can pull specific types of data down, etc. And so this is a schematic that my sister made on the left there, where you drag your time series data on. It computes a bunch of properties. So here we didn't do the full 7,000. For the website, it's just doing this set of 22 features that is most representative of that 7,000. And then it finds the most similar matches to your data, and then you can explore the rest of the library from there. And this is an example of what you get. So here someone's dragged on, oh, this is a piece of music from Sigur Rós. And you can see all the neighbors to this piece of data listed there in a little neighborhood. So maybe I play. I might have to reshare. Here. Okay. So here's the website. So yeah, you can upload multiple files or a single file here, or you can just start exploring. So if we browse by category, you can see there's audio data from animal sounds through music. There's different classes of data all the way through. Financial data, medical data, heart rates, RR intervals, rainfalls, astrophysics data. Well, let's try that. So as you go through, this is all the light curve data. You can download everything wherever you are. You can look at all these different types of data and zoom in on them, etc. Look for patterns, download individual time series, look at their neighbors. Let's go back, maybe bird song is better. Yeah, this is a better one. You can really zoom in and see types of patterns. And all the data has a category label and some tags, and you can search by tag as well. So say animal sounds is one of the tags. Yeah, we can pull all the animal sound data. And say I want to find neighbor, I'm like, this is a really, oh, actually this is quite an interesting one. Maybe I say this is an interesting one. Find neighbors of this guy. Every piece of data has its own page where it's the target. And so here's the target time series here, and we can look at it down the bottom. And so these are all the features that have been computed for this time series. You can see that some of these features are very high. So for example, its autocorrelation decay rate is very high. It's in the top 13% of all data. Has a very low mode of the histogram relative to its mean, etc. So you can start to look at what things are unusual about this piece of data, from entropy properties to periodicity measures. It's high in periodicity, for example. We can reset and zoom in on the time series, and we can also inspect some of these matches. Right? So it's saying that it looks similar to this autoregressive process with noise. We can zoom in on this guy and go, yeah, okay, maybe an AR model would be give similar properties to this data, for example. We can see all the different things down the edge that it's matching to. In this case, only music is the one. I guess music makes sense because this is a animal sound, but we can filter on just synthetic data, for example. If we're just interested in model or only real data, we can look at it as a list. So these are our neighbors in order of similarity. We can zoom in and look at these. Okay, somehow it thinks, I guess it's similar. So this is the Dickens Christmas Carol sentence length time series. Yeah, power law noise is often used for this. So often you find data that actually has been used to model or to simulate the properties in the real data. So this is like an empirical way to, a really dumb empirical way, but it's very easy to find sensible matches for data. And so here I've just gone to this as my target. And I can find matches to this power law noise process. And indeed, there are other power law noises, autoregressive noise. Yeah, so just double clicking on a node makes that the new target. And it will then retrieve all the neighbors for that new target. So you can hop node by node to explore the library of different. So now we're finding some human speech data, etc. So this is a way to see all the data. You can pull data from the API as you like. So you can have access to the full set of data at any point. You can also pull everything from a category. And here's the full instructions for doing that. Yeah, here are some examples of pulling specific types of data from the library. So that's a very quick process. I was going to show you, maybe I will quickly show you. Like if I drag a piece of data, this is what it does. It uploads the data. It's on the server, computed those 22 features and found the neighbors. Let's see if it works. I actually had problems just yesterday with the SSL certificate went down. Anyway, yeah, so it's working. So this is the data that I've just uploaded. And it's telling me where it sits with respect to all these features and the rest of the library. Yeah, this was a piece of noise that I uploaded, and it's saying all my similar synthetic data are different noise processes. So it also comes up here saying I can add this data to the library, and I can say what name it is, where it's from, who I am, etc. So people can upload their data like that, and you can also upload in bulk. If you have a big data set, you can put all the data up at once. This is important for us to keep the library as good a reflection of the current time series analysis literature set of data as possible. Okay. So why do we think this is a useful thing to do? Well, most databases are organized based on metadata. So people will self-label going, oh, this is a data of this type. And then you can maybe search based on those search strings or tags. But in this case, we're extracting properties from every piece of data that's uploaded and using that empirical properties to organize our database. And so it can flag surprising connections in ways that manually annotated databases cannot. And the idea is that as people upload their data, put their email address tag to their data, and then you might upload your data, find a very similar connection to someone who's already uploaded their data. Maybe you've generated a new synthetic model of time series and you've put some of your simulations up, and someone puts their empirical data up and it looks very similar to your model. You can then email that person and go, look, I've just uploaded my data. It looks very similar to your model. You know, let's chat. So it's just a starting point to kind of find connections between people based on their data and not based on the discipline they work in or the building of the university they're in, these types of things, to overcome those barriers to finding meaningful interdisciplinary connections. And the same type of approach could be done for all sorts of data types, networks, point clouds, images, etc. Here we've done it just for univariate time series. I think it's also good to have a very broad and open collection of diverse time series data to back up those types of issues I was mentioning earlier in terms of calibrating the strengths and weaknesses of analysis algorithms. And Kate Smith-Miles has this idea of the footprint of an algorithm over data space. So every piece of data every analysis method will work well on some pieces of data, bad on other pieces of data. And so to understand which classes or types of data or the structure in the data that's going to predict the methods that will work well on it is part of this kind of enterprise. And to do that well, you need lots of data to compare to. So this allows us, if someone has a new method for predicting, time series forecasting or something, they can pull down all of our audio data. They can pull down all of our ecology data, all of our, rainfall data, and go, this works really well on the rainfall, not so well on share prices. They can start to make these types of claims about where methods do well and where they don't. And so allowing people to constantly upload their data might allow us to remain a good reflection of the types of time series that are currently being analysed in the field. I think I've said that. Yeah, and then we might actually drive progress in the field. So if you find that you're working on a model for a class of data that already has many models that work well on it, you might go, actually, I should work on this area of data space where there are no good models yet. And you'll only know that if you look at where current methods are doing well and where the challenges for the field really lie. This allows you to do that in a data-driven, more systematic way. And you might think that the more sensible thing to compare is analysis methods. And we're actually developing a similar CompEngine for features at the moment, where you can drag your Python code on, it computes the output of that function, and then lets you know the types of features that are most similar to it that we already have in our library of methods. So you can already do this if you have MATLAB and HCTSA, but this lets people do it in a simpler drag and drop way. The idea being if you're peer reviewing a paper and someone has a new method that doesn't compare, there's no excuse for them not to drag their code onto this and at least report whether their method is reproducing, the performance of the standard deviation or something, something much simpler. We're trying to lower the barrier to making this comparison as much as possible. Okay, so I've gotten through to leave plenty of time for questions. Hopefully it wasn't too rushed. Sometimes it's weird to assess when you're sitting at home and you're talking to yourself, talking to your computer in a room. But yeah, this wasn't done just by me. There have been several students, Sarab and Carl have worked on this from Imperial. My supervisor when I did this, started this at Oxford, Nick Jones, who's now at Imperial there. And here are some summaries of some papers, and there's my details in the top right. So thanks for listening. Look forward to answering some questions.
That was really great. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Ben. I definitely have some questions, but I'll let other people go first.
So I don't know if you saw, I raised my hand, Michael. So
oh, yeah, sure.
I have a quick question. So Ben, thanks for that talk. It was really interesting to hear about those connections that you're making with the data sets and everything. So you mentioned Kate Smith-Miles. Are you aware of her laureate project website?
Yeah, Matilda,
yeah, because it seems like you guys are essentially trying to do the same types of things. I wonder if there's some ways that you can make those.
She's more looking at, for all these different classes of problems, how do we do this figure here, right? How do we see what different methods
how do you put them in instance space is what she calls it. Right?
Yeah, exactly. But for us, it's more comparing the features that can be extracted from time series. They're used for Kate to put data in a space that can then be used to kind of meta assess the performance of methods in that space. Yeah, but we've chatted a lot. We've been to conferences and workshops and stuff.
Yeah, because as you were talking, I was thinking of that immediately, because she's kind of doing that same, looking at comparing methods on different data sets, seeing which features are the important ones for those types of things. And
yeah, her work is also much broader than time series. She works with combinatorial optimization and networks, and but her work is really really great.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you guys were connecting in that sense. And
no, thanks.
Good.
I've got a quick question if nobody else wants to go immediately. I can't see this lower hand up. I don't know how to moderate that the hand function, although it's quite polite. So one thing that we're often interested in, obviously, when we have time series, is the relations among different time series. So obviously things like, so for example, you have a time series on, it's okay, go ahead. You have a time series on, Google and IBM, for example, share prices. And you don't just want to characterize each individually, you want to characterize the relationship.
Yeah.
Is that something that you're considering or have considered, or because there are obviously a bunch of different ways to do that characterization as well?
Yes.
Essentially sorry, go ahead.
The grant that we have now is on extending the philosophy to multivariate settings. So we're implementing lots of pairwise dependence measures, lots of statistics you can get from networks of dependence measures, these types of things. When you have many dynamics measured at the same time, like share prices or like brain dynamics or like this. But the scope of this project to date has been just univariate.
Oh yeah, of course. So another thing then on that is that even in the domain of univariate time series, different fields sometimes think about those in slightly different ways. So like in the social sciences and in economics, so macroeconomics, they usually treat a time series as coming from, kind of a single entity. So whatever, IBM stock price or something, share price. But then in microeconomics, they're often more interested in what they refer to as panel data. And a panel, it just means multiple entities measured at the same time, and then you stack the data. So they're basically concatenated. And then the analysis method is designed to account for that in some way, like a random effect or a fixed effect model or whatever. So for data like that, what would you recommend doing? Would you, obviously, in this kind of approach, you would upload them separately as unique time series. But that, and so then what that leaves, I guess, is kind of a whole area of social and other kinds of scientific methods not evaluated. So panel data methods, for example, is just in econometrics.
Yeah, we had to draw the line somewhere. I mean,
of course.
A lot of the methods, well, there were many struggles with implementing methods. And the first ones to go were those that only apply to specific data types. Because, for this to work and to be able to compute a matrix where you get an output on every, like whether it's a tree ring data measured once every year, or whether it's a, EEG data measured millisecond resolution, you want to be able to get a statistic out of any type of data that you put in. And so anything that has a specific, domain nuance to it was gone. Yeah. And then even amongst the ones left, often they're like, you can't automate that, because for me to use it properly, I need to look at a diagram and then choose the parameters with this method. And so there were things that we needed to attempt to automate as much as possible. It's no substitute for really a domain expert getting in there who knows how to work with the peculiarities of a piece of data. But in a lot of settings, you're not in that regime. You're like, here's a messy class of recordings, here's another messy class of recordings. I've got no idea what features to extract. And this is where you could push it on. But yeah, where there's domain expertise or subtleties that you can really incorporate into a model, whether statistical or mechanistic, of course, this approach won't. Yeah.
Right. I've got a quick question. Thanks for a great talk, Ben. I'm wondering if you use any similarity measures as features as well in your feature set, like distance measures, Euclidean distance, other types of measures.
Yeah, so our features have to just take a single time series in isolation and summarize it with one number. So all our features are of this type. So it can't look at another time series, for example. It's all just saying, here's my data stream, here's a statistic that summarizes some structure in that single data stream. And so where we use the pairwise measures is when we assess, say, how similar two time series are according to the rows of this matrix, for example. So I've measured these 7,000 things about one time series, 7,000 things about another time series. How similar are they? that's when we start to organize the feature vectors corresponding to individual pieces of data. But for actually measuring the structure of a single data stream, we don't use distance measures. Does that make sense, or was I answering something?
Yeah, no, I understand. And there's also patterns within a single time series, how those patterns. So does this work cover that? How, for example, if we have a pattern within the time series that matches another pattern in another time series?
No, we can't. So this, maybe I put something here. Yeah, this is kind of like subsequence matching. No, so when I say two time series are similar, I mean their properties are similar. So it wouldn't really distinguish things that are out of phase, for example, because it's not taking into account the measurement time 1, measurement at time 2. It's just saying these two have similar properties. Yeah, so these types of things, and even like looking at actually the middle half of the data is almost identical to the middle half of another piece of data. It's not trying to do that. It's just trying to summarize each stream as a set of features of that stream, and then comparing those features as an abstraction. But yeah, there are many applications where you want to do that. There are like dictionary methods for, okay, this sort of up, down happens a lot in this time series. So we're going to characterize how often that up, down happens. And that's a feature to characterize, or shapelets where, you know, we look at a subsequence and it matches this shape. Yeah, these are also useful things for some problems, but that wasn't the scope of what we were doing. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Hi, can I ask a question? Thanks for a great talk, Ben. I'm a psychologist.
Okay.
I had a quick look at your amazing CompEngine website, and based on my quick sort of scan, it looks like there's not a great deal of sort of self-reported psychological time series uploaded to the system. And I wondered whether that's just a coincidence, people just haven't gotten wind of it yet, or if there's something like, if you've had discussions with psychologists about their data and maybe discovered that actually it's not really appropriate, or somehow has quite different characteristics that would make it inappropriate for comparison with all these other kinds of time series you've described.
Yeah, I'd love to have some self-report data in. There's two main issues with medical data. One is whether it's allowed to be shared openly and freely. Sometimes people haven't done the ethics for just open, unlicensed sharing of individual data, even anonymized. Yep. And the second is that these types of data tend to be not evenly sampled, right? You'll get a measurement on the first of 1 month, and then they'll get to say depression severity or something, and they'll do another one, 3 weeks later. And so most of the data here, or all of the data here, are evenly sampled. And so it makes it very hard to work with what a equally sampled zealot like me would say missing data, but someone like you would just say, no, unevenly. We just got a measurement here, a measurement here, measurement. So if you had ones where like every week you got them back and did a thing, or smartphone data where you could average over, week by week and we'd love to have it included. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's good that you mentioned the unequal spacing. In the kinds of data that I work with, we have unequal spacing between measurements by design, because we want to sort of randomly sample people's feelings throughout, a couple of weeks, several times a day. So if that's problematic, ignoring those difference, the difference in the intervals between measurement occasions, that's basically what we typically do, just ignore them.
Okay. Yeah. That's
anyway,
that's one approach, is to ignore them. But say there is some temporal process underlying the data, you would miss that. And so, yeah, cases where there's uneven samples, you've got to do more subtle time series modeling, I think. Like you might fit some Gaussian process to your data. You might take the time lags into account for, there's autocorrelation variants that, take into account the gaps between data and the associated uncertainties between that. Some people just smooth it and they'll fit a smooth thing and evenly sample that. But yeah, it's a struggle to get it into this format.
Can I just
Thanks.
following up on that? As long as you're done, Pete. Yeah. Okay. Following up from that, so if you do have missing data, what would you recommend people do before they upload their time series? So, I mean, obviously, one thing they could do is they could actually just code for missingness, for example, and upload that time series, treat it as like a point process. And then you could look to see if there's a meaningful pattern in the missingness using your method, but then also in the actual data itself, what do you think?
Yeah, this is where it gets to
More that domain.
These sorts of decisions are domain specific. Yeah, sometimes, like you say, people will just, and these tend to be standard in fields. If there's a lot of like big stretches of missing data, they might put it as just the mean of the time series. That's the dumbest thing, right? Any stretch, you just put the mean in. Some people will linearly interpolate between the endpoints. Some people will fit a linear model to the whole or to the big section of string where they have good data and use that to interpolate so that you don't lose periodicities. You know, if you have something like going like this and then you have a big unused stretch and then it keeps going, right? It'll fill in some low dimensional model, whereas just setting it to the mean would do something like this. Linearly interpolating might do a sort of line like this. You can see you're missing all the subtlety. And if you just ignore that it was missing at all, you would get something like, it would just drop down like this. And you'd lose all the autocorrelation structure here because you've crammed a cycle back into the... So yeah, there's no one answer for that. You have to kind of think about the process in your data and what's appropriate for the question you're asking. But I would hope that data uploaded here has no missing. But I'm a theoretician and often I ask unfair things of experimentally.
Fair enough. Anybody else? What do you think? You've got him here right now.
Always happy to answer emails or this is a collaborative exercise. So.
Yeah, it's so cool. And just the very idea that, I mean, there are obviously a couple of, really neat things about it. And one is it looks very easy to use and people could just upload their data. People can upload their data almost as a requirement of, for example, submitting an article as conditional on obviously having dealt properly with domain specific issues like missing data, et cetera, or.
Yeah, and domain specific, there are many repositories that don't self-organize. And of course, they can upload it to like Figshare or, Zenodo or these types. But yeah, for this specific way of finding connections to other data, often it's just like something cool, right? It's just fun. But sometimes you do actually get interesting connections that make you think about what's happening.
Yeah. You're going to have kind of, there's this battle that's currently ongoing, kind of unfolding presently where data-driven methods are becoming increasingly common as data sets get larger and as, this thing called data science starts to emerge and kind of crystallize as a new, almost as a new discipline. And then substantive researchers, theorists, et cetera, who would normally justify a model, which is kind of what you were mentioning earlier, who would normally justify a model based on coherence, a theory of epistemology, where they say, well, we put a random effect or a fixed effect in the model because we think that, people are stable over time. We call that personality or whatever. And so they're going to have to figure out what to do, not just with their careers, but on an individual basis, working with data scientists in this kind of new reality. And so this is just, it's going to be interesting, I think, culturally.
This doesn't necessarily put people out of a job or anything.
No, I certainly wouldn't say that that's what you're doing.
There's no substitute for thoughtful reason, but kind of I would see this as like a portal. Like if someone gave you a data set like this and said, right, do your PhD on this. I want you by 3 years to separate blue from red, right? If you started that from scratch and just coming up, reading papers individually, implementing the method, trying that, trying another one, you'd go for years. But if you started and I told you a ranking of these 7,000 things and how well they did at that task on day one of your PhD, it could save you a lot of time, right? Because you go, actually, these are the most useful parts of the literature. I'm going to give the guy who works with this method a call. Then I'm going to give a guy, you know, from this other discipline who works on that method a call. You get all these people. It just directs you to the right parts of the literature and the right types of people to talk to. And so that person doing fixed effects modeling, right? Maybe they would be one of those people in this abstract.
Right. And they have to go talk to someone who studies the call of a finch.
Right.
So
in the data example, yeah.
That's right.
Starts to get more of a stretch in that case, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much,
No worries. Thanks,
Ben. And I mean, it's such a public service. Okay. Sweet. It's such a public service.
Take your headphones off.
Okay. And we're gonna, so obviously our time is over.
Yeah.
And thank you so much. And everybody, what I'll do is I'll upload this and then include the slides. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I'm happy to put those, give you those.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Ben.